Okay, William James's lovely book based on lectures, as a number of his lovely books were. Varieties of religious experience. Um, it's one thing that's great about it, I guess. Especially in its era. Although it's already, around the turn of the 20th century, it's already getting to be a pretty religiously eclectic era. Um, a lot of people in even like sort of intellectual circles or and upper class circles in Europe and the United States are exploring all kinds of alternative spiritualities. Theosophy, for example, which he mentions in the Will to Believe, or various kinds of spiritualism, contacting the dead and so on. Okay. Yeah, but he is just so open minded to such a wide variety of first person accounts of religious experience emerging from various traditions. That's the material of this book. Usually quite famous. I mean, some of the great, the Thomas A. Kempis or, Saint Teresa, great Christian mystics, and great, Sri Aurobindo, great mystics in other traditions as well. In a way, he's drawing on a literature, primarily a literature of mysticism, but this also includes firsthand, contemporary reports from that era of people's mystical experiences, which he tries to, regiment in some way, like, just to define them in contradistinction from other kinds of experiences, in terms of these kinds of differentia. Mystical experience is ineffable. It comes to you passively and so on. Okay. So, the basic orientation is that this is, that such experiences thus described are universal. Go right across traditions and yield similar results or conclusions to some extent in these different traditions. And he resolves to take that all seriously, even though he says quite straightforwardly that he doesn't really have any mystical experience himself. And when it comes time to try to get it as in the first person, he talks about alcohol and nitrous oxide. Experimented with them in order to try to get a mystical experience. Early version of, the kind of maybe psychedelic experimentation that a lot of people use to try to get or simulate mystical experience starting in the 50s and 60s. So that's very interesting. But it's so typical of James. Like, it's such a kind, and he resolves to take the reports seriously, even while, not necessarily, but maintaining a rational distance from them as well. He wants to know what they do, what experiences like this do in people's lives, how it affects their belief system, and and then also how it affects maybe the religious expression of a culture, etc. Okay. It's an odd book because it's hard to fit into a discipline. He's a psychologist, right? One of the world's most eminent psychologists, and he's invited psychologists to, well, I don't know, the Gifford Lectures. Must have been one of the earliest Americans to do that, I would think. I should have checked that out. Okay, so in some ways, I think he presents this as an essay in psychology. But that's an odd way to do psychology. He doesn't do surveys. He doesn't, he was always studying physiological psychology. Reflex reactions, or what thoughts tend to follow what thoughts and why. In other words, there's physiological and potentially other kinds of empirical psychological data. But his data here is the literature of mystical experience. It's a completely qualitative exercise in psychology by a person who was perfectly, able to do the quantitative as well. Let's say that's a simplistic distinction, but is it a work of philosophy? Well, he draws a number of sort of quasi-philosophical conclusions, but he's not wrestling, for example, with whether God exists and whether that can be proven or not. He does that elsewhere to some extent, and we read The Will to Believe, for instance, but not here. This is about psychology. It's about how experiences along these lines affect the individual having them. And actually, that's how he defines religion for the purposes of this book. It's the spiritual dimension of individual experience. Maybe he groped for a definition that would encompass all the world's even great religions. Maybe he was indifferent to that. But he says right at the beginning, these are parts of the book we're not reading. We're reading the chapter on mysticism and some of the later material. So it edges into philosophical territory continuously. For example, in our textbook, William Alston kind of extends the orientation to an experiential defense of the existence of God. That is, people experience it. Why do we think there are trees? Well, because people experience them. So why do we think there's a God? Well, one reason might be that people experience it, and that might be at least give reasons, since so many people have reported such experiences. But James doesn't go in that direction, not quite. But he does edge into the idea, like, well, we should be open to the idea that something is going on here. Thousands of years, thousands of people, similar experiences. He doesn't tell you in Varieties what he thinks is going on exactly. And he's probably open to various approaches to that question, actually. So it's an interdisciplinary classic, I would say, or it's its own beast. And again, he's not basing this on interviewing people who have had mystical experiences, although he definitely knew people who reported mystical experiences. We could work on that, including his dad and things like that. But like a psychologist would, it's literary. So maybe it's on all three of those disciplines: psychology, literature, and philosophy, or none of them. Okay. But he portrays it as an essay in the psychology of religious belief. One, I think, sort of lovely piece of work he does early on, and it would have some profound implications, is that he distinguishes between the origin of a belief or a belief system and its outcome. So one thing he is concerned to do immediately at the outset is to dispose of the objection, which many of his kind of scientifically oriented colleagues and so on, and friends, would have no doubt put to the eminent psychologist William James. When people report mystical experiences, visions of Christ, St. Teresa getting pierced by Christ's golden arrows and stuff like this, they're mentally ill. Okay, you want an explanation of that? Okay, I'm not feeling that Christ appeared in St. Teresa's room and pierced her with golden arrows. I'm feeling that she believed that she had some kind of experience like that. Maybe it's a dream or whatever, but that she was overwrought, highly neurotic, or psychotic. And I don't mean to pick on Saint Teresa. All you could dismiss every quote that appears in this book along those lines, and people did. And another thing is that people like Friedrich Nietzsche, maybe 10, 15 years before this, I have no idea whether James knew anything about this particular development yet in 1902, gave a genealogy of religion, of Christianity specifically, Judaism and Christianity specifically, a genealogy which diagnosed it rather than rather than attacking the doctrines or the truth of the doctrines or defending them for that matter. Nietzsche said, well, Judaism and Christianity originate in slave rebellions in morality and religion. They're expressions of the resentment of the oppressed toward the oppressor. Now, Nietzsche regarded that as discrediting them, actually, maybe because he preferred the glorious values of the oppressor in some way. But James's distinction would make a genealogy of religion like that, like discrediting it by giving its history, which is like ordinary. It has economic origins, right? It has political origins. I mean, maybe it has psychosomatic origins. Like maybe someone's a brain went wrong and people started following them. Or maybe a bunch of people's brains went wrong simultaneously, or whatever. What James argues, and he argues this beautifully, is that, well, first of all, maybe all human beliefs have pathological origins, more or less. I mean, they all have organic origins. They all have, like, they're all somehow in the neurology, okay? Scientific no less than religious beliefs. But like, okay, so for example, let's say that maybe you figured out that Einstein was neurotic. Everyone was neurotic in that period, in that place. He could have gone to Freud for analysis. Maybe he did. I don't know. And that actually, some brain lesion helped produce the theory of relativity. Guess what? That doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. Where does it take us? It gets confirmed in experience. It lets us do X, Y, and Z. Right? And that's the pragmatic theory of truth as well, which we haven't gone into at all, really. But, by their fruits shall ye know them. The belief is true if it helps us get on and understand. It's the results, not the origins. You can't discredit the truth of a belief by saying, oh, it comes from a funny brain state. Does it work? Maybe all our beliefs come from funny brain states. Or maybe we can't distinguish ones that do from ones that don't. The question is, like, can we confirm them and stuff? I don't know, but mystical experience raises particular problems in that regard, of course. Especially because it is ineffable. How are you going to confirm what you cannot express? Well, it's interesting. I'll just give you like a little flavor of this distinction between the origin and the outcome. Basically, the claim is the origin of the belief, even if it is pathological, is irrelevant to its truth, which is a matter of its outcome. That is, does it help us go on in a profitable, interesting, rich direction? Or does it help us reach some kind of inner peace or optimism, as the will to believe indicates that James thought religious belief does? Some of it does. Because obviously it can have the opposite effect too. You can torture yourself with a bunch of puritanical stuff, for instance, and the thought that you'll burn in eternal hellfire or whatever it may be. But anyway, Okay, so I'm just going to give you this flavor because one reason this really pleases me, it's right at the beginning of the book, is that he heaps praise upon Quakerism. And I guess over the last 10 years, I've been in this process of becoming more and more of a Quaker. So I'm not trying to sell you Quakerism here. That would be a crazy thing to do in a college philosophy of religion class. But this pleases me. If you ask for a concrete example of this, the distinction between a concrete example of the fact that it's not enough to diagnose the origin of a belief in order to discredit it. For a concrete example, there can be no better one than is furnished by the person of George Fox, the founder of the Friends, the Quakers. The Quaker religion, which he founded in the middle of the 17th century in England, is something which it is impossible to overpraise. In a day of shams, it was a religion of veracity, rooted in spiritual inwardness. Inwardness, that's Kierkegaard's favorite word. And a return to something more like the original gospel truth than men had ever known in England. Bold thing to say, maybe in Edinburgh in 1900 even. That makes you wonder why, he's not a Quaker, that William James. It's the best thing that ever happened, right? So far as our Christian sects today are evolving into liberality, for example, feminism, anti-racism, a focus on economic justice, and so on, pacifism, they are simply reverting in essence to the position which Fox and the early Quakers so long ago assumed. No one can pretend for a moment that in point of spiritual sagacity and capacity, Fox's mind was unsound. Everyone who confronted him personally, from Oliver Cromwell down to the county magistrates and jailers, hard job being a Quaker in the 17th century, in New England too, as well as England, seems to have acknowledged his superior power. They all reported a kind of spiritual effect, and on Fox's evident sincerity and so on. Yet, from the point of view of his nervous constitution, Fox was a psychopath. That's used in the 1902 term, I think, just meaning like a insane person, a person pathological psychology, or détraqué of the deepest dye. His journals abound in entries of this sort. These are famous passages if you ever really sit in Quaker meetings. As I was walking with several friends, this is Fox, I lifted up my head and saw 3 steeple-house spires, and they struck at my life. I asked them what place that was. They said Lichfield. Immediately the word of the Lord came to me that I must go thither. All right, like a voice came to him and said, go thee to Lichfield. Pretty easy to go okay, man, you're hearing voices, really? Okay, go to Lichfield. They said Lichfield. Immediately, the word, okay. Being come to the house we were going to, I wished the friends to walk into the house, saying nothing to them of whither I was to go. As soon as they were gone, I stepped away and went by my eye over hedge and ditch till I came within a mile of Lichfield. Like he ditched his friends secretly and walked off to Lichfield because God told him to do that. Where in a great field shepherds were keeping their sheep. Then was I commanded by the Lord to pull off my shoes. I stood still, for it was winter, but the word of the Lord was like fire in me. So I put off my shoes and left them with the shepherds, and the poor shepherds trembled and were astonished. Then I walked on about a mile, and as soon as I got within the city, the word of the Lord came to me again, saying, cry, woe to the bloody city of Lichfield, the Sodom. I don't know. So I went up and down the streets, crying with a loud voice. Actually, at this moment, England is being ripped apart by a civil war. Um, so I went up and down the streets crying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe to the bloody city of Lichfield." It being market day, I went into the marketplace and to and fro in several parts of it and made stands, crying as before, "Woe to the bloody city of Lichfield." And no one laid hands on me. As I was thus crying through the streets, there seemed to me to be a channel of blood running down the streets, and the marketplace appeared like a pool of blood. That's maybe a critique of capitalism. When I had declared what was upon me, and felt myself clear, I went out of the town in peace, and returning to the shepherds, gave them some money, and took my shoes of them again. Took my shoes back. But the fire of the Lord was so on my feet. Okay. So here's the argument. Like, okay, all right. Well, this is what he says about it. Medical materialism. See, I mean, this is an eminent psychologist engaged in physiological study of the human organism as well, but a skeptic of kind of overweening scientism, as we've definitely seen in Will to Believe. Medical materialism seems indeed a good appellation for this too simple-minded system of thought which we are considering. Like, okay, look, that's psychosis. You're going to take that seriously as data for your book? You're in the wrong bailiwick. Okay, we should be doing pathological psychology on this, not some kind of philosophy that brings you to take this seriously. These reports seriously. Medical materialism finishes up St. Paul by calling his vision on the road to Damascus a discharging lesion of the occipital cortex, he being an epileptic. Famous piece of diagnosis, St. Paul the epileptic. It stuffs out St. Teresa as an hysteric, St. Francis of Assisi as a hereditary degenerate. George Fox's discontent with the shams of his age and his pining for spiritual veracity, it treats as a symptom of a disordered colon. Carlyle's organ tones of misery, it accounts for as gastroduodenal catarrh. All such mental overtensions, it says, are, when you come to the bottom of the matter, merely affairs of diathesis, auto-intoxications, most probably, due to the perverted action of various glands, which physiology will yet discover. And I guess that gives you a little flavor of physiological psychology at the turn of the 20th century. But what he says is like, okay, on the other hand, let's look at the history of Quaker testimony against war. Let's look at the fact that probably Quakerism was the first first Protestant sect in England and the U.S., or what became the U.S., that treated women as ministers. Okay. Let's look at the amazing abolitionist history of Quakerism. They were right about all of that, says James. I don't know what Fox really saw, though. You know, was it pools of blood in the streets of Lichfield? I don't know what to make of that exactly. But I know I want to take this seriously because of its fruits, even if it were diagnosable. Like, even if this did emerge from someone's mental illness, you know, which he's not saying it did. I think for him, the origin of Fox's experience is an open question. It could even be God or whatever. Even if it did, even if it was a catarrh that a bad head cold that caused it, still, it created important and useful and profound transformations as it went on. and that's where the truth or falsity of it might be. So what I just want to emphasize is, as he gets into the reports of mystical experience, that is his orientation, and that's his like excuse for or his reasoning that gets him to a completely open-minded approach, where we're going to quote these experiences and certainly take them seriously on their own terms. Like, many of these are obviously sincere. And then we're going to see kind of like where they lead, because that's the test. And, where they lead is, okay, so I mean, mystical experiences is reported in all these texts and so on. Importantly, an important aspect of them is that they have an epistemic upshots. They change people's beliefs, right? I mean, and he reports different kinds. Like, there's a chapter on conversion experiences. So St. Paul is a good example, right? That mystical experience changed his whole belief system. And typically, mystical experiences do that. They're taken to yield knowledge of some level of reality, of some being, etc., while holding in abeyance the question of whether they do yield knowledge or whether there's an objective God out there. That's not the question of varieties of religious experience. But they are taken to yield knowledge. Now, what's the effect of that aspect of the experience? It changes your belief system. Well, I mean, his claim is that these mystical reports of mystical experience converge toward, for example, optimism. You're heading toward, it's possible that we will arrive at some kind of salvation, we might say. There's a point and a meaning, and I just got a glimpse of it. Okay. Now, we could really work some dark mystical experiences too that don't seem to yield optimism quite so. But we got to see exactly what he means by optimism. And I think this is quite right, like in many, many, mystical or spiritual traditions that I've examined and experimented with, perhaps. They lead toward monism, what he calls monism. They register an experience of unity with God, with nature, with all of being, with people among each other. They somehow, and I really, if you look at Taoism, if you look at Zen Buddhism, if you, they break down the separation of the self from other things, okay? And different traditions, different moments in different traditions define those other things differently. The physical universe, the layer upon layer of spiritual beings, or something like this. But they compromise the integrity of the self in a certain way, or at least the apparent integrity of the self. And at the outside, they suggest these experiences that all things are one. Okay? That is monism. Oneness, the experience of oneness is, oneness conceived with regard to different things, unity, unification with different things, or overcoming the delusion that one is separate. So there's maybe a kind of bookend where James says, I'm going to be concerned with individual religious experience on the one end. That's what I mean by religion. But then on the other end, the upshot of this experience is a feeling of the breakdown of the self in a good way, like the unity of the self, the overcoming of barriers between the self and God, nature, truth, the absolute, or us in a community. But the barriers between us that keep us from having an integral community. That's certainly central to Fox's approach, for example, in Quakerism. Well, okay, we will get into this, obviously. And we'll also maybe talk about William Alston's use of this as a kind of argument for God's existence. Again, that's a little bit of a betrayal of James's project, but it's an interesting extension. It's sort of immediately suggested. James assays that, like an argument from religious experience. All right. Maybe this is the last video lecture. I'm almost vaccinated. Y'all are getting vaccinated, I think. It's all good. Now I'm having terrible back problems, so I'm kind of a little laid up right here. But I'll be back.